get to hear the Federal Reserve speak on what they're going to do. This morning, we're going to sort of look not just at the short term, but the far term in terms of what are the challenges facing the Federal Reserve and the world as it copes with a central bank that is trying to get the economy out of this slow growth rut with the limited tools that it has. And I'm going to start with you, Mohammed, because it was either last year or the year before you were up here talking about how the Federal Reserve had entered uncharted territory, was deep into experimental policy, and it all made you very nervous. So my question to you is, here we are a year or two later, are you any less nervous? Now, are we any further back from that uncharted, are we more charted than we were before in terms of the territory the Fed is in?
So I'm nervous because I'm a parent of a 10-year-old, and I tend to take a medium-term view, and I'm more nervous than I was a year ago. Those of you who were here last year, I put up a cartoon that suggests that the Fed had taken us out of a very dark place, the global financial crisis, had done so really successfully, but now was in totally uncharted territory, knee-deep in experimentation, not quite sure the exact equation between benefit costs and risks. And in the last year, not only with the Fed, but virtually with every major decisions that the West has had to make, whenever it has come to making a consequential decision, the reaction has been to kick the can down the road. So a year later, we're still stuck in this new normal of low growth equilibrium and high unemployment and rising inequality. We still don't have clarity on some major issues, and the Fed has had to experiment more. So I am as nervous, if not more nervous, not about the next 12 months, but more about the next 5 years.
Vincent, I want to turn to you. The person who's going to lead us or lead the Fed through this next phase is Janet Yellen. She has been nominated by Obama. Odds are that she will be confirmed in the job and will take over on February 1st. What can we expect from a Janet Yellen Fed, and will the path that she takes on extricating us from these policies be any different from what we would have had under Ben Bernanke?
One thing to Mohammed's point, a central bank doesn't actually create supply. It can move demand. It can pull it forward intertemporally by keeping rates low. It could shift it internationally by depreciating its currency. But you don't create supply. If it just so happens to be resource slack, as in the United States right now, that leads to extra output. But over time, it really is about generating a path of sustainable increases in output. And we're not very good at that. And that's the real challenge over the medium term. That's the problem Janet Yellen faces. Immediately, this is a cyclical one. We still have resource slack. You know what will be the same? Janet Yellen was the chair of the subcommittee on communications. She believes in forward guidance, and so we will continue to see a Fed that works with a formal apparatus of giving signals about rates. It'll be a Fed that tries to solve communications problems by talking more. What's different is what was unique about Ben Bernanke. He had to be the most self-effacing person that could ever hold that job. He believed in a democratic committee, a small d committee, that groups make better decisions than individuals. And one thing a democratic chair never does is front-run the decision of his committee. Why? Because that would be presuming the outcome of a democratic process, implying that in speeches and testimonies, he didn't predict what the committee would do. He rather explained what the committee did and limited his forward guidance to explaining what the committee had already told us. Janet Yellen is not as self-effacing as Ben Bernanke. She's going to take the threshold apparatus as essentially setting the guardrails where the committee as a group limits the path for monetary policy, but she'll take it as her responsibility to explain where within those guardrails she'll be driving.
I want to actually drill down on the point that you've both raised now about the efficacy of the tools that the Fed is now using, because Mohammed, you said they simply don't have the tools that are necessary to solve what ails us, and the people who do have the tools aren't using them. But do you think that, and I know that is a view that's widely shared on Wall Street, do you think it's a view that has any purchase whatsoever within the FOMC, or do you worry that you have a group of people leading the Fed right now who are so locked into their worldview that they cannot see that what they're doing is not only fruitless, but possibly doing more damage than good?
No, I think the Fed understands. I think that they understand not only that they are trying to shift the demand curve, but I would go one step further, maybe Vince will disagree with this, that they're hoping that the shift in the demand curve itself will shift the supply curve, which further shift the demand curve. So you get two shifts, and next thing you know, you end up at a much higher level of output and employment without inflationary pressure. So I think they're looking for a number of shifts. The first one operates through the wealth effect and animal spirits, and then you get the supply response, and then hopefully you get another demand response. So I think they clearly understand that. I suspect today, once again, we're going to get downward revisions in their growth forecast. We've had it now for 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12, and we will get it for 13. So I think there's also an inability to forecast what other actors are doing, and other actors have created headwinds rather than tailwind to the economic recovery. I think the major issue is this difference between, on the one hand, a moral obligation to do something because you are the only policy-making entity with the flexibility and the autonomy that is required in this very highly polarized world. The Fed has it, so it has a moral obligation to do something, even though it doesn't have the right tools. So it's not a question about willingness, it's a question about effectiveness. And then the second issue is how they deal with markets. It was surprising to us how much they underestimated the reactions of markets. It is surprising to us that they don't realize that there's a basic conflict between a policymaker who wishes to focus on the journey to maintain optionality and gradualism, and markets who want to go to the destination, who want to try to get to the terminal value before others. And that makes any policy transitions very hard, and we saw this in May with the mere mention of taper.
So I quoted William of Orange so many times in the boardroom that when I retired, they gave it. I got a set of bookends with the quote, and that's one need not hope to undertake nor succeed to persevere. One version of what you just said is, if you drew up a list of the 15 things that could be done in Washington, D.C. to help sustain economic expansion, I'm pretty sure forward guidance would be about number 13, QE would be 15. The problem is 1 through 12 is not on the table because the political system is polarized. One question for the political economy to ask is the fact that they know the Fed is there makes it easier for them to fight amongst themselves. I think that was certainly clear in the debt ceiling discussion, for instance. They trusted somewhere there was an adult in the room to prevent themselves from doing real harm. And I think I'm in a wonderful position of being more pessimistic than you. And that is, I'm not sure that Federal Reserve officials are as realistic as you frame the issue. That I think this is what happens when you put macroeconomists in charge. They believe in the model. A Janet Yellen-led Fed in particular is someone who believes that, in the staff model, and it is within their ability through forward guidance to get better outcomes.
Well, this has raised an interesting question because, of course, if you ask the average FOMC member, well, here are the benefits of doing more QE, and they're smaller than they were last year, but they're still positive. They say, well, that's the world we have. These are the tools we have. Let's do it. But there isn't just benefits going into that equation. There's also costs. And we've heard people like Jeremy Stein, for example, talk about some of the distortions that the policies that they undertake may be causing in markets. What do you think those costs are, and how cognizant and how concerned should the Fed be about them? And do we get to a point within 12 months where they conclude that those costs are now large enough that even though they haven't achieved the goals they want in terms of shifting demand out, they need to stop?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure that when you've turned the term premium on the 10-year Treasury yield negative, that you...
Sorry, could you tell us what the term premium is?
So the difference between the 10-year Treasury yield and the weighted average federal funds rate over the next 10 years, that's really the compensation that investors get for taking on risk by going further out the maturity spectrum. QE, official institutions own more than half the U.S. Treasury securities when you add the Fed and foreign official entities. There is a risk you disconnect the Treasuries from the rest of the fixed income world. There is a risk, among other things, you're facilitating the bad behavior of politicians, that in individual markets you're encouraging the risk-taking, you're encouraging reaching for yield, and the decision to reach for yield is not always informed by how much risk is undertaken. And indeed, we saw a little case study from May to July that indeed some investors were not not aware of the risks they were taking, being encouraged by the Federal Reserve to go to other markets.
So I agree with all that, and I couldn't have said it any better. I would expand on one thing and add another. The one expand on, we are seeing people pushed, not pulled, pushed into trades. Okay, and there's a big difference between you pushed into trade and when you pulled into a trade. When you push into a trade, you're doing it because the alternative is so much worse. When you pulled into a trade, you're doing it because the fundamentals of the trade make sense. And what we've seen, this combination of rates floored at zero, QE, and aggressive forward guidance has pushed people to take more and more and more risk rather than ask the question as to whether their objectives should be reassessed. And that is the concern. I think Jeremy Stein's speech in February started picking up on that. There's something else which I know is not very popular, which is the spillover effects. So another concern that we have is that this policy, which is not only what the Fed is pursuing, but it's actually forcing other central banks to pursue, may end up breaking something globally. So this notion that these are domestic tools being used for domestic objectives is correct, but there are significant spillover effects when you happen to be the issuer of the reserve currency and when you happen to be the financial market with the deepest and most liquid structure, and therefore people have delegated financial intermediation to you. And another concern about the costs and risks is that there may be breakage elsewhere that feeds back into the US. And you hear that very clearly from policymakers in the emerging world. They say we couldn't cope with all the capital that came in, that was pushed out of the US into our markets as people reach for yield. And suddenly when it reverses overnight and causes major disruption in our FX market, there's a lot of collateral damage. So I would add to everything you've listed also that another cost and risk to look at are the global effects.
And we'll be hearing from Governor Carstens later, and that's exactly what he said
Sure,
in Jackson Hole. Remember, when you're heading for the exit, you're pulling me along.
But in fairness, that's not new. I mean, every Fed tightening cycle that I can read in the last 30 years has caused some breakage. So in 81, 82, the Volcker disinflation also precipitated the Latin America debt crisis. In 94, the reversal of the very low interest rate policy precipitated the tequila crisis. In 97, 98, even just the talk of a modest tightening precipitated the East Asia crisis. So it will always be the case that what the United States does will have these spillovers. Is it any worse now?
So I would tell you in every one of those things, there was two things that were different. And think of a car analogy, there were more spare tires and the potholes were smaller. So if you ask the question, if we end up in another systemic crisis, okay, what is the amount of policy flexibility left? It's much less. A lot has been used over the last few years. So compared to every single one of these episodes you've cited, there is fewer spare tires, if you like. Secondly, when we used to break something abroad, it used to be quite isolated. The world has changed. The composition of demand has changed. The composition of wealth has changed. So a lot of the systemically important countries are now outside the advanced world. And therefore, it's a much bigger pothole if you end up going there. So it's a bigger pothole with fewer spare tires.
I mean, if force equals mass times acceleration, positions are bigger, there's more funds out there to invest, and trading is faster. The investment decisions cross national borders quicker.
So even if one accepts all that, it's not obvious, therefore, what the policy implication is. Does that, therefore, mean taper sooner to get out of the way, or taper later because of the damage tapering will do? What do you do?
So first of all, we're talking about something that since it's the economists, economic students come across, which is once you're in the world of second best, it becomes very counterintuitive. Okay, the world of second best is so inherently complex that it's hard to do, and we got to remember that. In terms of taper, and I don't know about Vince, I was shocked that they didn't taper in September. Having conditioned the market, the door was wide open, and they would have gained a bit of optionality, which I think is very important going forward. So even today, I'm surprised, and I'll look forward to the FOMC minutes and everything else, to get a better feel. But I don't know about you, but I was really surprised that they did not taper in September.
No, I was quite surprised, mainly because I listened to what they had said, and what they had said really seemed to be that they were going to begin the project of renormalizing their position in the economy and in markets. And we know they got to get there somewhere, having paid the price for acclimating market participants to the idea that I still don't understand why they didn't actually execute. I think that there are always risks associated with these policies, and there's always these spillover effects. Second best is not obvious, but I think it's important to understand, at least from the vantage point of Federal Reserve officials, they probably think QE has run its course, that the balance sheet is big enough to provide as much accommodation through that channel as possible, and they're putting their chips down on forward rate guidance. So when they walk away from QE, it's not because they think the economy needs less accommodation, it's rather they believe they can provide it more effectively by the rate channel.
So if I could translate what you're saying, it sounds like even if we do not get the magical sustained improvement in the outlook for the labor market, we keep getting crummy numbers like we did last week, the Fed will still inexorably move towards its exit simply because it has concluded that the costs aren't worth the incremental benefit.
The slowness toward the exit will depend on the economic backdrop. Having said that they need a sustained improvement in the outlook, you need to see some employment gains. You need to see a forecast that has GDP picking up. But I don't think you're going to need much of a pickup in GDP to convince themselves that it's time to begin the process of balance sheet.
There's also a political argument. I mean, President Dudley put it in his speech a few weeks ago, which is that you may be politically more vulnerable on balance sheet operations than you are on forward guidance. So if QE is no longer providing you the benefits that it used to, right, you also have to worry about the political side to it. So I agree with him. This is going to be a very gradual pivot from QE to more aggressive forward guidance.
So it's interesting because one thing that we all think we know about Janet Yellen is that we think that she's a dove, that she has consistently staked out a more dovish position than the chairman on key policies. And to her credit, she's generally been correct. Mm-hmm. Her forecasts have been more correct and her policy advice has been more correct for the circumstances. Are we going to discover that there's a bit of a Nixon goes to China moment when she becomes chairman, that she in fact will not be the candidate for QE infinity, but will actually find a way to pivot away from QE perhaps sooner than the market expects?
So Janet Yellen believes that she's got a policy to forward rate guidance. She looks at the Federal Reserve Act and appreciates there's a dual mandate. She sees inflation below goal and the unemployment rate above the natural rate. She will keep policy accommodated for a very long time, lower for longer. But she has a wonderful opportunity starting with her confirmation hearings. She can explain that the best contribution to humankind's happiness she can make is to pursue the goal of price stability. She believes in the inflation goal the committee has. She believes that 2% is the right goal. We'll come out of that testimony and say, gee, she's not the uber dove we think. That's pretty reasonable mainstream monetary policy making. Then next year she'll turn around and say, she's shocked, inflation's below goal. And therefore, that's a reason monetary policy can stay accommodated for a very long time. And so I think it will be confusing. I think she will walk away from a policy instrument she doesn't have much confidence in, or rather has already done all the work you can expect from it and keep the balance sheet big, but rely on forward rate guidance to provide policy accommodation.
We have about 10 minutes, and I'd love to get some questions in here. If you have a question, please put up your hand. We have microphones available. Why don't we start over here?
All right. So quick question on forward guidance. So I think it's all well and good that they may be pulling back on QE, but how do they make the forward guidance credible while pulling back on QE? I mean, can they lean more hard on that lever in an environment where they're tapering?
So the best question to ask an FOMC member is, when you say forward guidance, and if 10 is a promise and 0 is an indication, okay, where is forward guidance? Okay, and you'll find very difficult to get an answer on that, right? So they would like the markets to believe it's a 10. Okay, however, operationally, it cannot be a 10 because there's so much uncertainty going forward. And that's why the pivot is going to be so complicated. I can tell you that for us, okay, we look at the three elements together, which is, again, rates at zero, forward guidance, and QE. And the one conclusion for us is the front end of the curve is going to be anchored for a long time. It doesn't mean the longer parts of the curve will be. No, they are going to be subject to a tremendous amount of volatility as you pivot away out of QE.
Yeah. So the only time I've been quoted today in the New York Times was a comment on when they put calendar-based guidance, which is this is as close to an unconditional commitment as the central bank's ever willing to make. And the fact is, if you read the words of the FOMC statement, there's as many more knockout clauses than the Bank of England has.
Oh, really?
So it's a loose form of guidance. I think the key problem is. Forward guidance works if you're laying out a credible plan. And right now, their problem is that the path for rates, they in the summary of economic projections, starting tightening in May of 2015, moving a quarter point every other meeting for a year and a half, and at the end of 16, having inflation at goal and the unemployment rate at the natural rate doesn't seem plausible to me. Another Newtonian principle, right, is how a committee operates. A body at rest stays at rest. A body in motion stays in motion. Once a committee starts going, it continues to move in that direction. So I find it unlikely they would start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. So I think what that implies is they'll just delay when they start raising rates longer and longer and longer.
Question right here.
Thank you very much. Bal Das from BGT Holdings, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Just to move away from the specifics I had for the panelists, I'd like their thoughts on the action of the central banks globally during the course of these crises. Does it portend, just to move away for a minute from the traditional analysis, which is what you are doing about inflationary expectation, monetary policy, fiscal policy, does it portend lessons for the future in terms of this crisis actually showing the role that central banks can play in a democratic apparatus, which from time to time in any given society, which is a democracy, will be rendered polarized, reflecting its people's perspectives and viewpoints? Thank you.
Vincent, you want?
So I think in some sense that, we went through a bubble, and the bubble was in central bank reputation in the sense that there would be these independent entities with a clean balance sheet and communicating only through an interest rate policy. What we've seen over the last 5 years is, given that independence, they've been able to be flexible, and given that flexibility, they've done fiscal policy on the fly. I think everybody's expectations of what central banks can and should do is permanently altered. And it will be a long time, probably a very long time in which we ever go back to that high water mark, the formation of the ECB. And I think that raises an issue important in democracies of governance. We're delegating fiscal policy actions to central banks, and central banks are the most undemocratic institutions there are.
Did you want to tackle that?
Yeah, there's a principle that you apply to high-performing individuals and high-performing institutions, which is don't let your strength become your weakness. And it's amazing how strength can become weakness. So the strength of a central bank, which was demonstrated incredibly in 08, 09, is to step in and normalize markets when market functioning is broken, right? And central banks were incredibly successful in that phase. In 2010, starting in the US, and then it happened later elsewhere, there was a pivot away from simply normalizing markets to targeting macroeconomic outcomes, and doing so with the hope that your list from 1 to 12 would come in at some point, right? That pivot was made initially out of sort of an obligation, and then once in it, you stay in it, right? And you go deeper and deeper, even though 1 to 12 isn't materializing. And I think the risk is going to be that you've ended up with a quasi-fiscal institution that is not subject to parliamentary review. And at some point, that issue is going to be brought up in the political process. So, again, the strength was you have incredible operational autonomy, you have relative political independence. You can act when others cannot, but be careful not to extend that to objectives that really rely on others participating. So I like your list 1 to 12. Actually, it's interesting whether I would have put it 13 and 15. I have to think about that. But I think that captures absolutely, okay, that the Fed simply doesn't have the right tools for what is required. What it can try to do is bring growth and market returns from the future to change behaviors today. But at some point, it has to hand off to those who can move the supply curve.
I think we have time for one more. Ryan.
Hi. So you've talked a lot about how difficult life becomes when short-term interest rates fall to zero. And it sort of seems like, based on the experience of the past few years, that when a central bank is targeting a low rate of inflation, the odds or the danger of running into that zero lower bound are higher than maybe we thought before the crisis. So once we get past this process of exit, how should the policy framework change to sort of accommodate those two facts?
So I think the fact that central banks define price stability as 2% around the world is a wonderful example of framing. It's framing because when they had the discussion in the mid-90s about what's the right goal, inflation was around 2, and it was how do you lock in the progress that Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan made. And they got 2 without a discussion about 2. So I think there is a reason to rethink what the right inflation goal is, but here's the awkward truth. And the awkward truth is aggregate demand is not that very sensitive to rates. And if you really wanted an inflation rate high enough to provide insurance against adverse shifts in aggregate demand, it'd probably be too high that you'd worry about some of the other effects of inflation. And so that means I think they have to think about different instruments, different ways of conducting policy rather than change the inflation goal.
Do you want to take 30 seconds for a quick, no? Okay. Well, fantastic. We're finishing on time. There's so many more things I'd love to be talking about, but we're going to plow on ahead. I'd like to thank Mohammed and Vincent for a really stimulating discussion this morning. Thank you. Thanks, Vincent.